Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're pleased to welcome Ina Park in support of Strange Bedfellows and in conversation this evening with Peggy Orenstein and moderated tonight by special guest Cornelius Jamison. First, a quick overview of webinars for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed, but you might want to keep that chat window open during the event, as I will be dropping links to purchase Strange Bedfellows from Literati. We also have signed book plates, and we can make your book available curbside downtown Ann Arbor or shipped to you anywhere in the United States. There's also a link to purchase books if you're watching later on YouTube in the description below me. If you are watching live, you can submit questions for the Q&A portion of tonight's event using the Q&A feature available to you at the bottom of your screen at any time. And I will read a selection of those at the conclusion of the conversation. And one last reminder, you can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com 24/7 to have available for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan or sent to you anywhere in the United States. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us from. And now I'll introduce tonight's author, our guest, and our moderator. Ina Park, MD, MS, is an associate professor at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine, medical consultant at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Division of STD Prevention, and medical director of the California Prevention Training Center. She holds degrees from the University of California, Berkeley, UCLA School of Medicine, and the University of Minnesota School of Public Health. Recently, Park has served as co-author of the 2020 CDC STD treatment guidelines and contributor to the Department of Health and Human Services STI Federal Action Plan. Fierce advocate for public health, she lives in Berkeley, California, with her husband and 2 sons. Peggy Orenstein is the New York Times bestselling author of Don't Call Me Princess, Girls and Sex, Cinderella Ate My Daughter, Waiting for Daisy, Flux, and Schoolgirls. Boys and Sex is out in paperback next week, and you can pre-order it on our website. A contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and Afar, she has also been published in New York, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and other publications. Her TED Talk has received over 4 million views. She lives in California with her husband and daughter. And moderating tonight's event, Dr. Cornelius D. Jamison is a family medicine physician and health services researcher. He is currently clinical lecturer in the Department of Family Medicine at Michigan Medicine and serves as co-medical director of adolescent health initiatives. His passion revolves around adolescent and sexual health, specifically preventing the transmission of sexually transmitted infections among minority and underserved individuals. His career in academic medicine focuses on integrating the clinical duties of primary care physicians with his interests in healthcare research and health policy to improve the care for adolescent and patients in underserved communities. They can't hear you, but they can sense it through the power of the internet. So please join me in welcoming Ina Park, Peggy Orenstein, and Cornelius Jamison into your living rooms.
Well, hello, everyone. So very excited to get into these books, and definitely want to start this off by just asking what inspired each of you to write on these particular topics for your books. And Ina, we'll start with you.
So first off, my hope with this book was to try to get us talking about a subject that none of us really wants to talk about, because it's so much easier to have sex than to talk about sex, and particularly its least intended consequences, such as STIs. So one of the things I talk about in my book was what inspired this. And I talk about my 7-year-old son who was hit by a car, and he's fine. But during this hospitalization, I watched him ask every single physician, nurse, and the hospital chaplain whether they had an STI, and talking about their sex lives. And I became inspired by this because I said, you know, if my son is so comfortable talking about sex, perhaps I'd be able to get people a little bit more comfortable about it as well. So actually the day he got home from the hospital, after his multiple surgeries, I actually started writing my book proposal that day. And, you know, several years later, here we are.
Yes, that was definitely a wonderful story as far as that goes, especially with the introduction into the book when it first began. It brought me in, and maybe I was like, I got to read more about this. This kid is so interested in wanting to to learn about STIs and talk about it with everybody that's there. And so awesome. Peggy, how about you?
I just got to say that's also such a testament to Ina as a parent and the way that she talks about her kids. And I'm so happy to be here because I really love her book, and I'm just, thrilled to thrilled that it's out, and hope that y'all help it be successful in the world. For me, I have to say that writing about boys was never on my to-do list. I have been writing about girls for 25 years. And it was really, to me, it was girls' lives that had been really transformed by the earthquake of feminism and their parents who were really motivated to make more change. But after I published Girls and Sex, and I was going around the country with it, everywhere I went, girls, boys, parents, everybody said, what about the boys? What about the boys? And I thought, that's really somebody else's job. And part of it was I wasn't sure what I would have to say, but I also, to be fair, I really underestimated the boys. And I thought, oh my gosh, I don't want to interview teenage boys. Teenage girls they don't have a reputation for chattiness, teenage boys. And I thought I'd have entire transcripts that consisted of, nope. And so, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that nobody was talking to boys. Nobody was listening to boys. And so I started doing interviews, and very quickly around that time, the Me Too allegations began. And, that created an imperative to engage young men really for the first time in conversation about sex, intimacy, and masculinity, because, we really have to know what's going on in their heads in order to better guide their choices.
Definitely. I think that's a huge thing. I will definitely co-sign on the fact that a lot of the teenage boys I have do not want to talk a lot in clinic. And I will say that once you start asking them more questions about sexual health and being like, okay, I'm open to this, I'm not judging you. What do you want to talk about? How can I help you out? And then all of a sudden, parents are out in the room. They're like, let's talk. Let's have a conversation.
I know. I would tell you that the thing that for me that I felt more than any specific conclusion, the biggest takeaway from the book was how much the boys wanted to talk, and how willing, what good narrators they were of their lives. And that was sort of, it just made me realize how rarely we give them a chance to really discuss their interior lives, and we need to create those spaces for them.
Definitely making a safe space. That's a huge thing. And I'll also say for both of you, it sounds like your themes were that you kind of stumbled into this, as far as you've already been doing these wonderful things and these great careers and already writing books for you, Peggy. And then, you stumbled into this as far as oh, let me write about this other part and go into this also. So I think that's really wonderful, especially for other authors people who are out there doing things and may want to write about this, other things in the future.
Yep.
So I'm gonna go into a different question here, and I'll definitely get some explanation behind it. So in your books, you both discuss the rise and popularity of dating apps, so such as Tinder and Grindr. For those who may not be familiar with dating apps that have been out there for a while, Tinder is one of the world's most popular, actually, dating apps that's there. And it invented the term swipe right, which you may have heard in other popular social and TV items and TV shows. But it allows individuals to match based on their profiles and also where they are. So it does the geolocation part. This one launched in 2012. And then you have Grindr. And Grindr is also location-based social networking and online dating app for gay, bi, trans, and queer people. And this has been around since 2009 when it launched. So kind of within this world as far as that goes. There's lots of different aspects that people can select different their personal type of what they're looking for, what they're thinking about, and also to give them the opportunity to have hookups as far as that goes and meet for sexual encounters, one-time hookups, and also for dating. Lots of people have met online and have marriage stories, and they may not tell that at the toast at the wedding, but they're definitely out there. I will say apps like Grindr have put on reminders for STI and HIV testing and screening to try and remind their patrons to make sure you go get tested. And they even, for a lot of men, they'll put up there to get PrEP as far as it goes, an option for those medications. I will say during the COVID pandemic, Tinder and Grindr did also put up reminders and recommendations for social distancing and recommendations to maybe hold off on going out into the world for a while. So that while they do try some public health options, it does also lend to the chance that there may be spread of STIs, HIV, and other issues that we have to look out for. So with that, Faye, I'll go to you first. How have apps changed the sexual landscape for young men, for the young men that you interviewed? And then Ina, how do you see these apps have affected sexual networks and sexually transmitted infections?
So a lot of the boys that I was talking to were underage, and I want to put a pin in that because I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But you know, it had a lot of different impacts. A lot of they were also the ones who were 18 plus were in college, so they would use it somewhat on campus as a hookup app. They also used it as a dating app, and I think one of the things that it has done, along with a number of other factors, along with mainstream media's perspective on sex, along with the rise of internet porn, along with silence around what sexual relationships can and could look like, it reinforces the idea of a culture of hookup culture, and that kind of notion of hot sex with a cold heart. And you mentioned hookup, Cornelius, and I just want to say hookup is the most non-word, right? It doesn't mean a danged thing. It might mean kissing, it might mean intercourse, it could mean, you know, you don't know what it means. And kids, because of that, they vastly overestimate what their peers are doing. And that can lead to unwanted sex or pushing harder than you otherwise might. What is different, and they didn't invent, they didn't invent casual sex. We know that. But the idea of hookup culture is the idea that physical intimacy should precede emotional intimacy, and that it is the path to a relationship. So sex first, relationships later. And that is a very big shift. And that's had implications across college campuses, across high school campuses. And what I often will say when I'm talking to young people is that, and it's fueled by alcohol. My goal was not to tell them the context in which they should be sexual, but it was to demythologize the hookup culture, which so many of them are ambivalent about, and to say, from a hookup, and this, I'm talking most largely about heterosexuals right now, or heterosexual hookups, you're likely to get a warm body, an adrenaline rush, a war story to tell your friends. That's a big one. You are less likely to get good sex or the tools you need to either create good sex or emotional intimacy. If you're a guy, you might also get an orgasm, by the way. And so knowing that, I think, helps them understand their choices better, and helps them make their understand their experience better as well. The other piece I wanted to say that I put a pin in before about underage was specifically about gay guys. And I talked to a lot of boys who identified as queer, male body people who identify as queer, who were going live because there's so little, we accept the idea much more of queerness, but we don't talk about the sex part. And because of that, those boys at the age of 15 and 16 and 17 were going on Grindr, lying about their age, and hooking up with much older men, and doing so without telling anybody. So, I'll get to Ina say what it is. One boy I just remember talking to, he said that he had recently gone to a hotel to meet a guy who was like 40. And he said he didn't like to do that because usually he preferred to go to somebody's house because he thought it was safer. This is a 16-year-old, right? I was like, wait, what? Because you go to somebody's house, they can, not to put too fine a point on it, they can chop you up and bury you in the backyard. Nobody knows where you are. At a hotel, at least somebody will find your body or hear you scream. But that concerned me a lot. And in terms of what parents need to know is that if we have kids who are queer, and educators too, if we're not normalizing and discussing the sexual practices and healthy relationships with queer kids, they are engaging in some very dangerous behavior.
Yeah.
Very true. Yes.
And I think from my standpoint, being in the field of STI research, we have just seen an explosion in the STI epidemic. And I think part of it is maybe that was going to happen anyway, but I really feel like dating or sex seeking apps sort of like threw fuel on the fire that was kind of already smoldering. Because I think, one of the things that happens, at least for my patients, is just the incredible convenience makes it sort of irresistible. And some of my patients actually talk about getting kind of addicted, you know what I mean? Because hooking up is so easy. And I'll just give you an example. It's causing people's sexual networks really to collide in ways that we, never would have seen prior to the smartphone and prior to these apps. So I'm just going to give you all an example of a colleague of mine. We were sitting in a crowded lecture in an international conference, and he, sort of lost interest in the speaker, and he decided he wanted to hook up. And by hook up, I mean, in this case, have some kind of sex, not just kissing. And so, within 10 minutes, I'm sitting next to him, right? And I'm listening, trying to listen. And within 10 minutes, he had found somebody in the same, lecture hall, in the conference hall from a different country who was looking for, the same thing. And they met up right afterwards. And so the sheer efficiency that we have here at getting two people to hook up, one person who usually runs in, these circles, another person who usually runs in these circles, suddenly with the app, they're connected immediately. And so whoever they've slept with in the past couple of months, plus the two of them, are now in a big sexual network together. And so the efficiency that you have here can actually spread STIs really quickly, particularly if people are having sex with multiple partners. And so we've noticed, in San Francisco, where I see patients, that the number of folks who are getting STIs and they're saying, I met my partner on Grindr, or I met my partner on one of these sex seeking apps, it's more than half now. And before, there, people used to go out to bars and have to make conversation, and you would meet people that way. And now it's just all, so convenient. Patient said it was easier to find sex than to get a pizza delivered. I mean, that's how convenient it was.
Ina,
Yes.
I think that we should mention the new CDC report and the way that it unites our work. Can you do that?
Oh yeah, you mean you're talking about the CDC released press release, a week ago, saying that 1 in 5 Americans has an STI. So I think, and Peggy and I actually are working on a piece together discussing how, and half of those infections are among young people, 15 to 24. So
half of new cases every year.
Yeah, half of the cases every year. And so, Peggy and I have been talking about whatever we are doing in this country in terms of educating people about sex, when we're talking about the education system, is clearly not working. And we're just fueling STIs even more. And Peggy can talk about this later, that a lot of folks are not getting their education from their parents or from school, but they're getting it in other places where they shouldn't, such as porn.
Very true, definitely. Especially, I really like how you put that, the hookup culture, as far as that goes, and just the efficiency, as you said. You can get sex quicker than you can get porn. I mean, I think you can get pizza as far as
not quicker than you can get
porn. Porn you can get really quickly also.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure people have also done that in the conference if they get bored.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
But pizza takes 35 minutes, right? Or 40 minutes.
It takes a while, yes.
Yeah.
But then pizza is the best metaphor for talking to kids about sex. So do you know the pizza metaphor? That instead of, we use the baseball metaphor, right, in our culture, which is a very, that it's an adversarial metaphor. And like there's, as one boy said to me, there's winners and losers in baseball. Yes. Who's the loser? Right. And actually the other person is really the field, not even the other team, right? They're the field on which the game is played with the base. But pizza is all about like shared experience, and you would never like shove pizza down somebody's throat. That would be weird. You have to negotiate your toppings. You have to be communicative. You want the other person to have a good time. Much better metaphor.
Wow. Way better.
Negotiating toppings, yes.
That could be very challenging.
It can, depending on who the friends are, for sure. Going back to the new CDC report and talking about how it says there's 1 in 5 people who have an STI as far as it goes. And a lot of this data is coming back from 2018. I will say that there's always been, with the increases in the STIs, we've seen that African Americans, Blacks, Latinos have had increased rates of infections versus whites. throughout this, and that also goes with other minorities, and then also for the adolescent group, usually the 15 to 24-year age group. So I'll bring up this question, and how did you each find that racial identity stereotypes about race factored into folks' dating preferences, and then their sexual mixing patterns? And then for you, Ina, in particular, how does that influence the risk for STIs and HIV?
Sure.
Peggy, first, do you want to take that?
Oh, I first. Oh.
Sure.
Can I just say though, I just want to say Ina's book is incredibly funny, and we're having this very serious conversation, and I like laughed out loud a million times when I was reading it. So if you're thinking that this is going to be like a homework read, it is very, very fun. And we're talking about sort of the more serious stuff. We were talking about race. So I did want to say, I was going to say when we were talking about the apps, that race really figures heavily into the apps, and that there's been a huge issue, particularly on Grindr, around sexual racism on Grindr, and especially around, in the ways that I'm about to talk about. So I was looking at young people in predominantly white environments, in college-bound kids or kids who are in college. And in those environments, what I began to believe was that African-American guys and Asian-American guys were like flip sides of a coin, with white masculinity controlling the toss. And what I mean was that white masculinity was seen as this kind of neutral, as this norm, as almost invisible. And by comparison, Black masculinity was fetishized, but also more likely to be seen as predatory. And that created a lot of anxiety in the Black guys that I spoke with. So they would say things like, I'm not going to go party with a bunch of drunk white kids, because if anything happens and I'm the only Black guy in the room, I'm the only Black guy in the room. And then on the other side of that coin, Asian American boys were having asexuality and emasculation projected onto them. And that was having an impact too. So with one of those guys, actually we're talking about Tinder, and he had matched with a girl, and they were going back and forth until she said, hey, we could be friends, but no offense, I don't date Asian guys. And he just looked at me and kind of just like went, how is that no offense? Right. It's totally, and it was really interesting to me, because especially right now, our young people are so attuned to social justice and to issues around race and racism and racial justice, but they don't often self-interrogate around their ideas in terms of sexual racism. And that is a place that we really have to talk to our kids, and predominantly white institutions have to be conscious not only of how young people are fitting into the classroom, but how they're fitting into the social circles as well, and how we can abet that.
And some of the really entrenched stereotypes and biases that Peggy talks about in her book, they strongly apply to the field of STI, as you mentioned, Cornelius. As you know, we have huge racial disparities. And one of the examples that I write about in my book is the story of a couple who I call Daryl and Aisha. And, Daryl is an example in this case because, like many young Black men, he had unfortunately been incarcerated. And during that time that he was on the inside, his girlfriend had another partner. And when he got out, then he had contracted an STI. And one of the things that I talk about is that, this isn't always, true, obviously, for every individual, but in the studies that have looked, at Black and white women, 9 out of 10 Black women say they really just want to partner with Black men. Whereas only in the study that I'm, talking about half of Black men felt the same. But when you have, in certain communities, this story that I mentioned about Daryl and Aisha, you have communities that, due to mass incarceration and violence, the sex ratios of men to women are completely thrown off. So there are many less eligible Black men than women. I'm talking about heterosexual folks here. So in that case, what you end up having is the men who are, available having concurrent relationships with more than one woman, and then putting women at risk then, for STIs and HIV, because, Black women on average do not have more partners than white women, and they are actually more likely to use condoms, but they have a higher rate of STIs because of these structural factors, structural racism and mass incarceration that are actually affecting their communities in ways that they don't have control over. And when we talk about Black men who have sex with men and Latinx men who have sex with men, if there's a lot of, preference for dating within the race, the networks are even smaller. And so when we talk about something like HIV, the lifetime risk, for a Black gay man is, almost 1 in 2 or 1 in 3. So, you can just see that there are all these forces controlling, who gets an STI or who gets HIV that people are not aware of. And people's preferences and stereotypes that Peggy talks a lot about in her book, they're all intertwined and they all sort of, feed off of each other.
Very true, yes. And I'll piggyback on what you were talking about there regarding the MSM community and also going into what is known as like the DL or the download community, as far as being able to, they do not talk about, being gay or being bi as far as that goes throughout the rest of their culture. And so it also plays a factor into like, how is their culture set up to accept them and whatever they are on the, queer spectrum as far as that goes. And so that can definitely be an issue. I've seen that with my patients, particularly where they do not, want to talk about certain things. If they did contract something, and I was like, oh, well, let them know, tell them about this. I can, have a visit for them one day and treat them as far as that goes, or, test them and screen them. They're like, no, I really don't want to like, talk with them, or I because of the dating apps, maybe I don't have their, their phone number or anything like that anymore. I can't contact them. And also, by the way, please don't tell, my girlfriend or my wife, who may, as a family medicine physician, I may also be, they may also be my patients as well. And so it's always one of those things where you're like, okay, we definitely need to have a conversation, because it's partly goes into some of the stigma in the culture as far as that goes. And so that leads me into my next question. When we discuss, a topic like sex, often there's concepts of shame and stigma that come along with it. So what stories in your books best highlight how people can feel stigmatized in the course of their sex lives? And what are your ideas on how we might combat stigma and shame around sex and STIs?
So I can take this first, and I have to say, it's been interesting the way people react to an STI diagnosis, and I talk about this some in my book, is that some are just absolutely devastated, and it completely changes the narrative of how they see themselves, particularly if, when you're giving someone an HIV diagnosis or a diagnosis of HSV or, herpes type 2. They think about how it's going to affect the rest of their sex life, who they are before the diagnosis, and how it changes their identity after the diagnosis. And then I have folks who have just gotten so comfortable with, the idea, and, they'll say, hey, doc, I'm on the treadmill again. Like, I have another STI, and shoot me up with some antibiotics, and I want to get back out there. You know what I mean? So, the range is very wide, but I have to say that part of the reason why I wrote this book is I feel like there are more people who feel stigmatized and ashamed by the diagnosis, as opposed to just being matter of fact, like, oh, I had sex. This is sort of part and parcel, the cost of doing business in the sexual marketplace. And I'm trying to move people more over to, not still taking it seriously, but just understanding that just like COVID-19, just like, getting a cold, it's just one of the things that happens to us just because we're alive. And I would really like not to, for there not to be such a profound psychological toll from receiving this type of diagnosis. And I have to say that I think the biggest culprit around this is probably HSV, herpes simplex virus. It happens for HIV too, but there's such a huge community of support around HIV now. And there's no, walks or galas for genital herpes, and no celebrities coming out there and telling their life is so fabulous and they have HSV. So I think that the stigma is greater there, and I think because of the way people view STIs in our society, that it's some sort of punishment for being a promiscuous person, that people feel guilty, and then therefore they worry that they'll be judged or rejected if they have to disclose it to partners. So I think that's where the roots of this come from. And I think normalizing the fact that every single, as Peggy talked about with the CDC report, we're all going to get an STI at some point if we're sexually active, and most of us are. So I think if we just normalize that, that's going to help reduce the shame and stigma around these infections.
Very true. Yes. Peggy, your thoughts?
Well, I guess, that makes me even zoom out further and think about how we shame and stigmatize around sex in general, and the ways that we miseducate our kids around sex, and starting from the get-go. And I mean, I can talk about this from girls or from boys' perspective, but again, we have kids growing up steeped in a highly sexualized culture. That's distorted, that's commodified, that's transactional. And we have virtually no sex education, no conversation about what they might want from their sexuality and their sexual exploration. And that is not to say that, and I mean that in the broadest terms. I mean holding hands, I mean kissing. I'm not talking about like rushing into penis, I think PVI, but penis vagina intercourse, like, as soon as possible. And one thing I think that we could do to alleviate that, and I talk about a lot of things in the book, but if you look at the example of other countries, I always like to look at the Dutch. And there's one study in particular where they took 400 college students at demographically similar schools in the United States and in Holland, so apples to apples. And they talked about their early sexual experiences. And the Dutch had everything we say we want. They were more responsible in preparing. They had less pregnancy. They had less disease. They had less stigma. They were more likely to enjoy it. Everything. They were less likely to be drunk at the time, all these things. And when they did in-depth interviews and they asked what the difference was, what they found was that the Dutch kids said that their parents, doctors, and teachers had talked to them from an early age about sex, pleasure, and the importance of mutual trust and connection in their relationships. And it wasn't that the American parents were necessarily less comfortable talking about sex, but we tend to frame all our conversations in terms of risk and danger. And the Dutch talk about balancing responsibility with joy. And now, like Ina, I'm a mother. I have a 17-year-old. And I know that if I had not delved into that research, I would have thought I was being very progressive by talking to my daughter about, disease protection, contraception, and consent. And now I know that, that's not enough by a long shot. Not by a long shot.
Yes, I do recall recently on Twitter, I think people were talking about how it's necessary to take the sex talk, and move it from one discussion into several over a long time period to really get that opportunity to like talk with your child, bring them up just like you were saying, you talk with them over a course of what's going on and explain, this is sex, this is hand holding, this is kissing, this is, if you keep with the baseball metaphor, first, second, and third base as far as that goes, but trying to talk with them over a long period of time. So it's not just one talk and then we don't discuss it ever again until maybe you come home pregnant or something else happens. I will also say the growing up with the sex ed education that I had, it was definitely that risk and danger that you talked about in the book of pictures that occurred back in the day. That was just books of pictures of horrible things that happened if you had sex and it was unprotected.
Yep.
Yeah, and that was not fun, but you were scared. I was scared at least. And so I definitely remember those, and that definitely wasn't, the best sex education that occurred.
I have never heard of that.
It's absolutely hard. Yeah, I will. If I find it for you, I'll email you old copies of that. But yes,
Please do.
There were pictures they would show in sexual education class that we had. I'd say sex ed class. It was not really the greatest thing, but they would just show these pictures, and you were like, okay, so don't have sex until you're married, and then this won't happen to you. So yeah, very scary. Which leads into definitely like you were saying. Regarding talking with parents particularly, and you mentioned this earlier, Peggy, regarding the queer community and like how a lot of the boys don't have the opportunity to talk to their parents about things, and parents aren't really sure what to say, and then having these early discussions. I would say both of your books focus on storytelling. So you each end with your words for advice for readers, including for parents particularly who might be wondering, how do you talk to your kids about sex, the age-old question. And so what are your words for wisdom around this? And Ina, if you want to go first for this one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad you're asking this, because my book is not an advice book at all. It's supposed to be like a funny storytelling thing. But then at the end, I said, well, I have to say something because it's one of the first questions that I get if I'm ever talking to a lay audience, and an audience of non-clinicians. They say, well, what should I be talking about, and how do I start? And so first of all, I don't expect folks out there to be as comfortable talking about this as I am, although I know I have a few colleagues in the crowd who probably are. But I don't expect you to start at 5, which is probably when we started, but it's actually not a bad idea in terms of giving age appropriate sex education, even from a very young age, which is what they do in the Scandinavian countries. I think one of the things I would say is I want parents to normalize STIs and normalize having sex, and normalize STIs as sort of something that comes along with having sex because it's true. And really to have a message more of, I know you're going to have sex, and a message of empowerment, to tell them the best thing that they can do is to get tested, encourage their partners to get tested. And, I think as a parent, there's just so much pressure on us from, a lot of different, factors. But I think around sex, parents sort of put pressure on themselves to say, like, I'm going to get it all done in one talk. And I actually wrote it all down. One time when I was writing this book, I wrote it down and I said, it's going to be 25 to 30 talks, like the different little subject areas that I'm going to have. And one of the things that I think parents also are going to, worry about is that they're going to embarrass their child, and their child's going to put their hand over their ears and say, oh my God, please stop talking to me. I can't stand this. But I'm telling you, and my sons do this even because they're sick of hearing about STIs and about consent and masturbation and all of those things. But even though they put their hands over their ears and they say, I can't do this, they know that you are willing to talk about it. And even if they're not willing to talk to you now, they might come to you later, and that is exactly what you want. So even if you didn't get the message completely in, they knew that you were trying to open the door. And I really think that that could help you later. And I thought I had my whole list. Like I was really proud of myself, and I said, okay, and I'm going to be doing all of the talking. I have 2 boys, by the way. So I said, I'm going to be doing all the talking because of my line of work. And, that's my lane, and I should take that. And then I read Peggy's book, and that really changed my mind about who should be doing the talking and how soon I should be talking about porn. So I'm going to leave it to Peggy to talk about that a little bit.
Oh, I wasn't going to talk about porn. But, I can.
No, I mean,
but yeah, I mean, I, the thing is that we tend to, everything that you've said, everything that Cornelius said is right on. And we tend to talk about sex like it's in a silo over here, and that it's not connected to other aspects of really our citizenship and our etiquette and how we treat people. And it's really not that, it's really easy to integrate a lot of these discussions. First of all, yeah, you've got to start you name the body parts when a baby is a baby. You start right there. Lessons of consent, those happen when a child is on the playground, and you don't hug somebody, nobody hugs you. Or if Aunt Nancy doesn't want to hug your child, or wants to hug your child, and your child doesn't want to hug Aunt Nancy, well, suck it up, Aunt Nancy, because that's a lesson in consent that your child needs to learn about bodily autonomy. There's a lot of these little things that are not necessarily about sex. We have to talk about gender dynamics. We have to talk about media. All of these things play in. And so, yes, the way that I think about it is, if you imagine that you had to teach your child table manners, and you thought you were going to sit them down at the table and say, here's your fork, here's your knife, don't burp at the table, say please pass, here's your napkin, say excuse me, okay, go forth and be polite. That would be ridiculous, and you have to tell your child 365,722 times to say thank you before they do it on their own. So I would say our sexual health is at least as important to our well-being as our manners. So I think we have to think about all these different things. And I would say particularly for dads out there, or men in boys' lives, whether it's stepfathers, dads, uncles, whoever it is, the boys that I talked to were very clear. And again, in that, hand over the ears, talk to me, but don't talk to me way. But they were very clear that they wanted to hear from the men in their lives. And they wanted to hear about the emotional aspects of sexuality, not just the physical aspects. And they wanted to hear about men's regrets and mistakes, and how they handled those. And I know that that is really hard for men, because you weren't raised that way, you weren't parented that way. And, I would just say, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to know all the answers. You don't have
Right.
to know all the questions. You don't have to have the perfect relationship yourself. You just have to start. Like, just
Right.
start wherever you can start. And that is just take the step. That's what I would say.
And it was a relief to me because I just felt like as a mother, it's my responsibility. But, you know, after I was talked to Peggy about it some more, I was like, oh, great. I'm going to give some of that up to my husband and he can take it on. Even though I want to, it's actually better to hear from the other man in their life.
Yeah.
And it's,
yeah. And I will also say, just as a resource on my webpage, which is just on my website, which is just my name, PeggyOrenstein.com, I have a resource list that will help you whatever age, gender identity, sexual orientation your child is, give you some resources for you and for them on that will help you with some of these conversations. And to the porn point, if your child is in 5th grade and you haven't started talking about it, you better start talking about it, because we do not have the luxury of silence on this one. And I would really recommend for children that age going over to amaze.org, AMAZE.org, also on my website. They have a really great video for kids. And then there's some resources for parents on how to have that conversation.
And so just because of you, Peggy, I moved it up in my timeline of conversations. So we've talked STIs and we've talked porn now. So I feel proud of myself.
So
and we're not done. It's only that was only one conversation. We have more to do.
That is such wonderful advice from the two of you. That is wonderful. I really hope, you know, the parents that are out there, anybody that's thinking about this or has, you know, kids, and they were able to take something from that for sure. I have some other questions, but it is a little after 7:45, so I want to bring John back in and ask if there are questions from the audience who have submitted some and want to talk to you guys today.
We do have some questions. And the first one from Claudia is a question for Ina. If we were to move away from thinking that accepts STIs as part of life, how do we change the way we talk about condoms and harm reduction, especially with young people, knowing that there has been an impact of message fatigue with the HIV epidemic and condom use over the last 20 years?
I mean, I think that is really tricky. I mean, we didn't even get into this, but especially now with young people are using more long-acting reversible contraception, such as IUDs and implants, and then there's also for folks who are at risk for HIV, a lot of people using pre-exposure prophylaxis or PrEP. So it's like a daily birth control pill for HIV. So when you're taking those forces combined together, young people are looking at this and saying, I'm just not sure that, that the condom is for me. And we're seeing, based on like the national surveys, a decline in condom use at first sex with young people. And so I think, what we can do is really give the information and say, unfortunately, in terms of STI protection, both the internal condom, which we used to call the female condom, and the external condom, or what we used to think of as the male condom, that's pretty much all we have for barrier protection right now in terms of preventing STIs. And so not to judge at all, because I think as soon as an adolescent feels judged about what they are or aren't doing, they're going to shut down. But I think, being honest with them and saying, yes, STIs are a part of being a sexually active person, and they're probably going to happen. And right now, these are the limited prevention options that we have. So just being honest with them. And then, you have to ultimately leave it up to people to make their own decision.
Thank you. We do have one other question, and then I want to remind people that they can submit questions if they'd like, but I'll ask this question if there are no others. I'll turn it back over to you, Cornelius, for maybe the final question. So a viewer writes in, and Peggy, you've sort of already touched on this, but perhaps it's an opportunity to explore a little bit more. A viewer writes in, our 16 and 12-year-old sons don't ever want to talk about sex with us. They are not dating anyone yet. Do we need to talk to them about porn? Do we need to know whether they are watching it? I think they would deny it no matter what.
Yeah. The short answer is yes.
Yes.
Yes, you do. And I will say with boys that it can be easier to talk to them in motion or in activity. With all young people, I think it's easiest in the car, because you're not looking at each other face to face and they can't escape. That's always helpful. So the whole landscape of porn has changed, right? And it's changed not just because of the internet, not because of the smartphone, but because in 2007, Pornhub dropped the paywall and made everything that you can imagine, and a lot of things that you probably don't want to imagine, free, accessible at the touch of the mouse. And I never asked a boy, do you want watch porn? Because that would have been ridiculous. I said, when did you start? And typically they would say 11 or 12. And if it happened earlier, it was because somebody showed it to them. I'm doing the smart, that's the phone. It wasn't that they wanted to see it, but, and what they're learning in that mainstream porn is, it's not a sex positive vision. It is a distorted idea of sexuality that shows, sex as something men do to rather than with women, that shows female pleasure as a performance for men, that shows these wildly distorted bodies. And there was just a report out the other day, a really great nationally representative sample that showed that it was a good news, bad news. The bad news was that it was for 14 to 24-year-olds. 18 to 24-year-olds cited pornography as the most cited source of the best information of how to have sex with a partner, higher than talking to the partner yourself. However, so that was the bad part. The good part was among 14 to 17-year-olds, they said parents were the best source of information. So we have an opportunity, if we're willing to, and I know you'd rather poke yourself in the eye with a fork than talk to your kid about porn, but we have this opportunity, again, to talk about what's real, what's not real, what's missing, and offer alternative sources of education on healthy relationship and sexual decision-making that will serve them ever so much better. And I don't think you can, like curate your kids' porn. I don't think you'd say, hey, what are you watching? But to be able to say, I went to this webinar or I was reading this book, or I was listening to a podcast that Ina or I did, or something like that. And this is what they were saying. And I'm just curious what you're seeing in your world, and talk about it in a little bit of a depersonalized way. That helps a lot.
We do have a couple more questions that have come in. So we'll get to those. First, and maybe related, can you talk about, and I open this up to all of you, can you talk about using humor to break down barriers around talking about STIs and sex?
Yeah, I mean, I tried this a lot in my book, because the problem with STIs is that there's this ick factor associated with them. And so what I wanted to do was sort of draw people in with the stories, and then I'm laughing. Wait, no, this is gross. No, but I'm laughing. You know what I mean? And so I was trying to use humor really to turn that little sort of ick factor into a little bit of wonder and fascination. And you're laughing and you're interested and you're engaged. And so that's how I wanted to use humor, not to make fun of the condition or at all to stigmatize folks that are living with an STI or dealing with an STI, but really to make people feel more comfortable, because suddenly they were laughing about something that they normally would ordinarily never laugh about or even want to think about.
Yeah, I usually use humor to make fun of myself as I'm going around, talking to 18-year-old boys about sex, which is sort of weird. But it's always been important for me in my writing, my whole writing career. I write about some difficult issues, and if I'm not funny sometimes when I write about them, I mean, it's just too hard. And right. So I've always been. I think it always surprises people, either that I'm funny, I think I'm funny, or that my books are funny, or have an aspect of humor to them, along with poignance, along with anger, along with a lot of other things. But I just think, the spoonful of sugar always helps.
Mm-hmm.
There is a question here too, as well, about, and for Ina, what are some of the funniest stories you have heard about sex and STDs?
Well, some of them didn't make it into this book, but let me tell you, when you ask people about their sex lives, they just really want to talk to you and tell you crazy things. But one of the stories that didn't make it in was from a friend of mine who is more sexually active than I am, which is not saying much, but he was, if you can imagine a sandwich of three men, and he was one of the pieces of bread on the outside, but the other piece of bread, on the outside was trying to tell him that the person in the middle actually had an STI while the three of them were naked and engaged in the act. So it was one of those unimaginable situations. And I tried to make it work in the book, but it didn't make it. But there's plenty of those that were on the cutting room floor, but I was so happy to hear all of them, and they all made me laugh, and I'll never forget them.
I think we have maybe time for one more question, and maybe Cornelius, I can turn it back to you for one more question that you had both for Peggy and Ina. And I do want to pass along a message from a viewer. Please say hi to Ina from her friend and colleague Dave Templeton, dialing in from Sydney Friday
Sydney,
lunchtime.
Australia. All right.
Got
Lunchtime,
2 copies.
wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's dedication to STIs, you guys.
Yes.
But yeah, if there's maybe a wrap up question, Cornelius, you wanted to get to, otherwise I can throw in another question from the audience as well.
Sure. I don't know. Do you guys want to do another question, or you want to do an audience question?
Sure.
It's your choice.
We'll do your question, Cornelia.
Okay. So Ina, you are a first time author, and Peggy, your book, Boys and Sex, was your 7th book, and that'll be paperback, I think, on the 9th. Yeah, that's wow. For those in the audience who, they want to be writers, they're budding writers, what helps both of you in your process? And then also, for these particular books, which were sections where you got stuck? What ones were really difficult to write? And how did you really get through that?
Am I starting there?
Yeah, you could start.
Sure.
Peggy.
Yes.
Because you're
having a writing buddy, Ina and I were writing buddies, and that really helped a lot, honestly. And being able to go away for a few days together here and there and work on our writing and leave our husbands and children behind, and just focus and realize that if we didn't take that focus time and actually use it well, we were total losers. That totally helped. But I guess what I always want to say to neophyte writers is, don't think that just because I've written 7 books, it comes easy. It is really hard every single time. And I think one of the best books about writing is Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird. Mm-hmm. And, she talks about it. It's basically a bunch of tricks to get yourself to do it. Whether she talks about imagining a small picture frame and trying to fill it with your words, writing a shitty first draft, not thinking too much about it. I used to have above my desk 2 note cards that said stitch, stitch, because Diane Johnson, who's another writer, had said, that you just need to look. She was a sewer. I'm a knitter, but that she needed to just look at the next stitch when she was writing, because if she looked at the whole project, she would become paralyzed. So there's a lot of ways that you sort of trick yourself into going a little further, going a little further, going a little further, and trying to find the way. And just, don't imagine that there are people for whom it just flows out of it. Just that doesn't, I don't know anybody like that. I don't know anybody like that.
Yeah. And I mean, I have to say, so when Peggy and I, we went away twice. And so if I saw her writing and I wasn't writing, then I would feel guilty, and it would make me say, okay, I need to take my eyes away from Twitter or whatever I was looking at, or my email, and actually buckle down. And then, there was a lot of hot tubbing and talking about porn and vaginas and hanging out in robes, and just that the bonding of bouncing ideas off another writer is huge. Yep. And we all brought our stuffies here, our STI stuffies and vagina stuffies here today. I think the camaraderie of writing together was huge for me. I'm really happy that I had that opportunity with my first book. And there were times I absolutely felt stuck, and I felt like I'm never going to be able to do this, but I already signed a contract, so I am screwed. And I'm just going to have to make it happen. Every chapter had to be funny. And the herpes chapter, because herpes is so stigmatized, I would just read a section and I would say, this is not funny. And I'm not going to stop until every chapter has some element of humor in it. Otherwise, this book is not going to work. So it takes some tenacity to force yourself to push through it when you read it and you know that it's not right, and then making it right. But oh my gosh, I got so many gray hairs from the whole process. It is really hard.
It is hard. Can I say one more thing about Annie, about Anne Lamott's book, which I loved, which I always think about, is that she talks about the mythical radio station KFKD or K-Fucked, that plays in the head of every writer. And so one speaker is blaring out, you are the most brilliant, you deserve to be on the New York Times bestseller list, the world is waiting for you. And the other one is just a hit parade of doubt and recrimination and, you suck. And your task as somebody who wants to write is to quiet both of those voices down enough so that you can eke out a coherent paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour. I just want to thank you all again so much for joining us this evening on At Home with Literati. Peggy set me up for it, so I should mention that Anne Lamott will be doing an event with us on March 5th. So you can find information for tickets on that on our website. But you can purchase Strange Bedfellows and pre-order Boys and Sex at the event page that brought you in here tonight. Peggy Orenstein, Ina Park, Cornelius Jamison, thank you so much for joining us. To all of our attendees, thank you so much for joining us as well. We hope you continue to stay safe in all ways and be well. And we'll see you at the next event. But until then, take care and good night, all.
Good night.